Hey guys, welcome back. Go ahead and dim the lights, find your most comfortable blanket, and just sink in. Tonight, we're going to drift back a few tens of thousands of years, before the emails, before the 9 to 5, before the crushing weight of modern taxes. We're going to talk about the original masters of the cozy night in, our Paleolithic ancestors. Because while we like to think of them as these rugged, shivering survivors fighting off saber-toothed tigers every 5 minutes, the reality of their winter sleep schedule was actually kind of a vibe. So let's float back to a time when the housing market was just a really solid limestone overhang, and the only central heating was a pile of dry moss and some very questionable animal furs. Imagine, if you will, a valley in what is now southern France. It's about 30,000 years ago. The wind is howling and the temperature is dropping into the absolutely not range. But inside the cave, it's surprisingly okay. See, caves are nature's original insulation. While the outside world is a frozen hellscape, the cave stays at a steady, boring temperature. It's the original basement apartment, minus the damp smell and the weird landlord. Our main character for the evening is a guy we'll call Grog. Now, Grog wasn't a brutish oaf. He was actually quite the interior designer, provided your aesthetic is everything must be made of reindeer. Grog's biggest flex wasn't a gold watch. It was a really thick layer of mammoth fat and a cave floor lined with aromatic grasses. Because why wouldn't you want your bed to smell like a meadow while a blizzard rages outside? It's all about the sensory experience. Grog and his family didn't just sleep on the cold stone. That would be a rookie mistake. And Grog was many things, but he wasn't a rookie. They built beds, real beds. They layer up ash from the fire, which acted as a nice bug repellent because prehistoric bedbugs were definitely a thing, and then pile on top of that layers of broad-leafed plants and animal hides. It was essentially a multi-layered memory foam mattress, if the memory foam was made of things you hunted earlier that Tuesday. And the best part? No alarms. When the sun went down, you went down. If it was a particularly brutal winter, the tribe might just decide to stay in bed for, 16 hours. It's the ultimate guilt-free nap. They practiced what scientists call segmented sleep, where you wake up for a bit in the middle of the night, chat about which cousin is the most annoying, maybe snack on some dried berries, and then drift back into a second, deeper slumber. It's almost enviable, honestly. No blue light, no scrolling through news feeds to see what's falling apart today. Just the crackle of a dying fire, the steady breathing of your kin, and the knowledge that as long as the fire stays lit, the cave is the safest, quietest place on Earth. Let's look at the decor of these winter retreats. Our ancestors weren't just throwing things in a corner. They had zones. A kitchen zone, a tool-making zone, and the do not disturb zone. The back of the cave was where the real sleeping happened. It was further from the drafty entrance, deeper into the earth's natural warmth. It was dark. It was silent. It was the kind of sensory deprivation chamber people pay $300 an hour for today, but for Grog, it was just home. Of course, there was the constant threat of a cave bear moving in, but let's be real, every roommate situation has its drawbacks. At least the bear didn't leave passive-aggressive notes on the fridge. As we drift further into the night, think about the rhythm of that life, the slow, deep breaths, the transition from the orange glow of the embers to the deep, velvet blackness of the cave's interior. Everything was slow, everything was rhythmic. There was no rush to be anywhere, because in the middle of a Paleolithic winter, there literally was nowhere else to go. You just existed. You slept. You survived by being the best at doing absolutely nothing. The art of the Paleolithic pile. So we've established that Grog's cave was basically the prehistoric version of a luxury spa suite.
if your definition of luxury involves a lot of unwashed mammoth hide. But let's get into the actual technology of the sleep setup. Because, believe it or not, our ancestors were surprisingly picky about their bedding. They weren't just collapsing onto a pile of rocks like a cartoon character. No, they were much more sophisticated than that. Archaeologists have found evidence of bedding that was intentionally layered. At the bottom, you'd have a thick layer of ash. Now, this wasn't just laziness regarding the fireplace. Ash is alkaline. It's a natural insect repellent. If you're a prehistoric person living in a cave, your biggest nightly enemy isn't a wolf. It's the tiny biting things that want to turn your legs into an all-you-can-eat buffet. So the ash layer was the original bug spray mattress topper. On top of the ash, they would lay down medicinal plants. We're talking about things like wild mint or Cape laurel. These plants didn't just smell nice, though, let's be honest, in a cave full of 20 unbathed humans, smelling nice was a high priority. They also contained natural chemicals that kept mosquitoes and flies away. It was a chemical warfare-grade sleep system designed by people who really, really hated being itchy. And then came the furs. Now, we often see depictions of cavemen wearing one-shouldered leopard print outfits, which, let's be real, is a bit much. In reality, their furs were highly functional. During the brutal winters, they used layers of reindeer hide. Reindeer hair is hollow, which means it traps air. It's essentially nature's version of a high-end puffer jacket. If you have 2 or 3 layers of reindeer skin between you and the ground, you aren't feeling the cold. You're basically floating on a cloud of trapped thermal energy. But the real secret to the caveman sleep strategy wasn't just the bed, it was the pile. In the modern world, we're obsessed with personal space. We want our king-sized mattresses and our sides of the bed. But 30,000 years ago, personal space was a recipe for hypothermia. The social structure of the sleep cycle was intensely communal. You slept in a heap. It was a giant, multi-generational cuddle puddle. You had the elders in the middle, because they were the ones with the stories and the wisdom, and probably the best at keeping the fire going, and the younger, hardier members on the edges. There's something incredibly soothing about that image, isn't there? The absolute lack of loneliness. You didn't wake up in the middle of the night wondering if you were alone in the world. You woke up because Uncle Fag was snoring or because a toddler was kicking you in the ribs, but you knew exactly where you belonged. And let's talk about the fire. The fire wasn't just for cooking or keeping the lions away. It was the rhythm of the night. Someone, usually the person who had napped too much during the day, would be the firekeeper. They would sit in a half-doze, occasionally tossing a branch of dried oak or a bit of animal bone onto the flames. Yes, they burned bones. When wood was scarce in the frozen tundra, dry bones made a surprisingly good fuel. It produced a low blue flame that lasted for hours. It was the original nightlight. The flickering shadows on the cave walls weren't scary to them. They were a screensaver, a slow, shifting animation of light and dark that signaled safety. Because as long as that light was dancing, the world outside, the biting wind, the shifting glaciers, the hungry predators, couldn't get in. Let's lean into the irony of it all. We spend thousands of dollars today on weighted blankets to simulate the feeling of security. Grog didn't need a weighted blanket. He had a literal mammoth hide that weighed 40 pounds and the physical presence of his entire extended family pressing against him. That's about as grounded as a human being can get. And because they were living in sync with the seasons, their winter was essentially one long off-season. When the snow was 6 feet deep outside, there was no point in hunting. The berries were gone, the roots were frozen in the ground. So what do? You conserve energy. You enter a state that scientists sometimes call social hibernation. They weren't quite bears, but they weren't exactly active either.
They would spend days in a state of low-energy existence. They'd tell the same stories over and over, the one about the great elk that got away, or the time the river turned to ice. They'd work on a piece of jewelry or a flint tool, but slowly, very slowly. Imagine a world where your only responsibility for 3 months is to stay warm and not annoy your cousins. No deadlines, no checking in with the office, just the slow passage of time marked by the length of the shadows on the limestone wall. And they also had a very different relationship with the dark. For us, darkness is something to be conquered with LED bulbs and streetlights. For them, the dark was a blanket. It was a physical presence that told their brains it was time to shut down. Their melatonin production must have been off the charts. They didn't have a tiny glowing rectangle in their pocket telling them that someone they went to high school with is on vacation in Bali. They just had the dark. And in that dark, they dreamed. We know they had complex inner lives because of the art they left behind. When they finally did wake up from their long winter naps, they'd crawl into the deeper recesses of the cave, places where the light of the sun never touched, and paint. They painted the animals they missed. They painted the world they wanted to see again. It's almost like the cave was a giant brain, and they were the thoughts inside it. As we float further into this Paleolithic night, think about the silence. Not the silence of an empty room, but the silence of a world without machines. A world where the loudest thing you'd hear at night was the cracking of the ice in the valley, or the distant howl of a wolf that was fortunately very far away. It's a heavy, comfortable kind of silence, the kind that makes your limbs feel like lead and your eyelids feel impossible to keep open. Grog is probably adjusting his reindeer fur right now, shifting his weight against a smooth rock and drifting back into a dream of the coming spring. But for now, spring is a long way off, and that's okay, because the fire is warm, the cave is deep, and the pile is cozy.
The midnight feast and the dream world. So, we've settled into our communal pile, the ash is keeping the bugs at bay, and the reindeer furs are doing their job. But as anyone who has ever tried to sleep through a long winter night knows, sometimes your stomach has other plans. In the modern world, this involves a guilty trip to the fridge for a slice of cheese or a bowl of cereal. For our friend Grog, the midnight snack was a bit more of a process, but no less satisfying. Imagine waking up in the dead of night. The cave is silent, save for the rhythmic breathing of your clan. The fire has burned down to a deep, glowing orange heart. You're not hungry in the "I haven't eaten in days" sense, but rather that low-level winter hunger, the kind that craves fat and salt. Grog wouldn't even have to stand up. Within arm's reach of the sleeping area, they kept the pantry. This wasn't a cupboard, but a series of baskets or stone caches filled with the high-calorie spoils of the autumn. We're talking about marrow bones that had been cracked and saved, or pemmican, a mixture of dried meat, melted fat, and crushed berries. It was the original protein bar, and it was calorie-dense enough to keep your internal furnace stoked for the next 6 hours of sleep. There's something very grounded about eating in the dark, surrounded by your sleeping family. It's a primal sort of comfort. You'd gnaw on a piece of dried venison, the salt hitting your tongue, and watch the embers. Because why rush? The sun won't be up for another 8 hours anyway. This was the second watch, a time for quiet reflection or hushed whispers with whoever else happened to be awake. This brings us to the social side of prehistoric insomnia. In a world without books or screens, the quiet hours were for oral tradition. If Grog and his grandfather both found themselves awake at 3 a.m., this was when the real history of the tribe was passed down. No flashy visuals, just a low, gravelly voice whispering about the Great Flood or the spirit of the mammoth. These stories weren't meant to be exciting. They were meant to be repetitive and comforting, the original sleep stories.
And once the snack was finished and the stories were told, Grog would drift back into what is perhaps the most fascinating part of the caveman experience, the dreams. Psychologists and anthropologists have long wondered what our ancestors dreamt about. When you spend your entire day tracking animals, napping flint, and staring at the flickering geometry of a fire, your subconscious has some pretty intense material to work with. But because their lives were so physically demanding and so deeply connected to nature, their dreams were likely much more vivid than ours. Imagine dreaming of the hunt, but in that strange, fluid way dreams work, where the deer has the antlers of a tree and the wind speaks in the voice of your mother. For Grog, these dreams weren't just brain noise, they were messages. They were a way to process the world. When he woke up, he might go to the back of the cave, the sacred, quiet space, and use a piece of charred wood to sketch what he saw. This is why we see those incredible paintings in places like Lascaux or Altamira. They weren't just decorating their living room, they were documenting the dream state. They were bringing the spirits of the deep cave out into the light. And the best time to do that? Right after a long, deep winter slumber, when the line between reality and the dream world is at its thinnest. Let's talk about the luxury of this slow time. We often view the Stone Age as a time of constant struggle, but during these brutal winters, they actually had more leisure time than the average modern office worker. Once the cave was secured and the food was stored, their work week dropped to almost zero. They spent hours, literal hours, just grooming each other. It's a very primate thing to do, but it's incredibly relaxing. Removing a burr from a fur cloak, braiding a sister's hair, or just the tactile sensation of human contact. This releases oxytocin, the cuddle hormone, which lowers cortisol and makes falling back to sleep a breeze. They were essentially biohacking their way into a state of total relaxation. Of course, the winter wasn't all berries and naps. There was the constant, low-thrumming awareness of the fire. If the fire went out, the cave became a tomb. So the fire was the heartbeat of the tribe. It was the sun they kept in a circle of stones. The smell of wood smoke would have been permanently etched into their skin and hair, a scent that even today makes most humans feel a strange, ancestral sense of safety. As the night progresses in our imaginary cave, the air stays surprisingly fresh. You'd think a cave full of people would get stuffy, but caves have their own natural ventilation. The cold air from the entrance pulls the warm, smoky air up through cracks in the ceiling or out through the main opening. It's a natural air exchange system. So Grog is breathing in cool, crisp air while his body is buried under layers of warm fur. It's that perfect cool room, warm blanket ratio that sleep experts rave about today. And the floor? It wasn't just dirt. By midwinter, the floor was a thick, soft carpet of discarded grass, wood shavings, and bits of fur. It was bouncy. It was insulated. It was a floor you could actually live on. Let's lean into that feeling, the sensation of being completely tucked away from the rest of the planet. There are no satellites orbiting overhead. There are no borders, no politics, no global events. There is only the cave, the fire, and the pile. The world is reduced to a radius of 30 feet, and within that 30 feet, everything is known. Everything is familiar. The irony is, we spend our lives trying to build security out of bank accounts and insurance policies, but Grog's security was physical. It was the weight of the mountain above him and the warmth of the person next to him. As we drift toward the end of this part of our journey, imagine the fire beginning to fade into a deep, pulsing red. The midnight snackers have all tucked themselves back into the furs. The hushed whispers have died down. The only sound left is occasional pop of a resinous branch in the embers and the distant, muffled sound of the wind trying and failing to find a way inside. Grog closes his eyes. He isn't worried about tomorrow's hunt yet. He isn't worried about whether he's productive enough. He's just a human being,
existing in the quietest era of human history, letting the slow, heavy rhythm of the winter night carry him away. And as he drifts, we drift with him, moving away from the fire, deeper into the darkness of the inner cave, where the spirits of the mammoths wait in the shadows of the stone.
The slow thaw and the winter brain. So, we've made it through the deepest part of the midnight hours. The marrow bones have been enjoyed. The fire has been banked with ash to keep the coals glowing until morning, and Grog has slipped back into that heavy, dream-filled slumber. But eventually, even the longest Paleolithic winter has to start yielding to the sun. However, unlike our modern world where we flip a switch and the lights are on at 6 a.m. regardless of the season, the transition from the winter brain to the spring brain for our ancestors was a slow, meditative crawl. In the late winter, the cave becomes a sort of time capsule. Outside, the world might be starting to drip. The ice is cracking with the sound of distant thunder, and the first hints of damp earth are beginning to cut through the frozen air. But inside the cave, the rhythm remains sluggish. This is the period of the Great Linger. You see, Grog and his family didn't just jump out of bed because the calendar said March. They didn't have calendars. They had the light. As the days incrementally lengthened, the sun began to reach just a few inches further into the cave's mouth each morning. That golden finger of light crawling across the limestone floor was the only alarm clock they needed. And even then, they probably hit the prehistoric snooze button for a few weeks. There's a specific psychological state that happens when you've been in a low-light, high-sleep environment for months. Your metabolism is turned down to a low hum. Your thoughts are less like a rushing river and more like a deep, still pond. This winter brain was actually a survival mechanism. By staying calm and moving slowly, Grog was burning fewer calories. He was making that store of dried meat and fat last just a little bit longer. Because why double down on physical exertion when the ground is still too frozen to dig for roots? It's much more efficient to stay in the reindeer fur pile and work on your indoor hobbies. This was the peak season for Paleolithic craftsmanship. Imagine the scene. A circle of people sitting near the cave entrance where the light is best, but still wrapped in their blankets. There's a soft, rhythmic clink, clink, clink as someone naps a piece of flint into a needle-sharp arrowhead. Someone else is using a bone needle to sew a patch onto a boot. There's no rush. There's no quarterly goal. If it takes 3 days to polish a single bead made from a fox's tooth, that's 3 days well spent. It's the ultimate slow living movement, 30,000 years before it became a Pinterest trend. And as they worked, they talked, but not about big things. They talked about the mundane details of their world. They talked about which patches of the valley would thaw first. They talked about the birds that would soon be returning from the south. They were remapping their world in their minds, preparing for the transition from the inner world of the cave to the outer world of the tundra. Let's float over to the children in this scenario. For a Paleolithic toddler, winter in the cave must have been an absolute dream. You're never alone. You're always warm. You're constantly surrounded by a rotating cast of aunts and uncles and grandparents who have nothing better to do than tell you stories and show you how to twist fibers into string. There was no bedtime because the whole season was bedtime. Of course, the snarky side of history reminds us that it wasn't all perfectly poetic. 20 people in a cave for 4 months means a lot of, well, let's call it communal friction. Someone definitely snored too loud. Someone definitely had a habit of taking the best spot near the fire. And someone, there's always one,
probably told the same story about the great salmon of 28,000 BC every single night until everyone wanted to move into a different cave. But that's the beauty of it. The brutal winter forced them into a level of social cohesion that we can barely imagine. You had to get along. You had to share the furs. You had to trust that the firekeeper wouldn't fall asleep and let the embers die. This shared vulnerability created a bond that was stronger than any modern contract. As the thaw continues, we start to see the first signs of spring cleaning. This wasn't about aesthetics, it was about hygiene. They would take those grass and ash beds that had been their sanctuary for months and drag them to the mouth of the cave. The old, compressed vegetation would be burned or tossed away, and fresh bedding would be brought in. The cave would breathe again. The transition back to the active life was gentle. They'd start with short trips just to the edge of the woods to see if the sap was running in the trees or to check the high ridges for the first signs of migrating herds. They'd come back to the cave at night, still seeking that safety, but the pile would start to loosen. People would sleep further apart as the air grew warmer. The intense, huddling intimacy of winter would slowly dissolve into the expansive, energetic freedom of spring. But Grog would always carry a bit of that winter brain with him. That ability to drop into a deep, restorative sleep the moment the sun touched the horizon. That knowledge that no matter how chaotic the world gets, there is always a center, a place of darkness, warmth, and family where the wind can't reach you. As we reach the end of our journey tonight, think about that final night of the deep winter. The air is just starting to lose its bite. The ice is small because the cave doesn't need as much help to stay warm anymore. Grog lies back on his fresh layer of mint and dried grass. He listens to the sound of a distant stream. The ice is finally melting. He's survived another one. He's rested. His mind is clear. His belly is full of the last of the autumn's bounty. He's not a primitive man struggling against a cruel world. He's a master of his environment, a man who knows that the secret to survival isn't just fighting, it's knowing when to stop, when to huddle together, and when to just sleep. The shadows on the wall are still dancing, but they're different now. They're lighter, more playful. The deep, heavy velvet of the midwinter night is fading into the soft, gray silk of a spring dawn. So as you settle into your own version of a cave, your bedroom, your blankets, your quiet space, take a lesson from Grog. Forget the productivity of tomorrow. Forget the cold of the world outside. Just focus on the breath. Focus on the warmth. Focus on the fact that for tonight, just like for our ancestors 30,000 years ago, the only thing you truly have to do is exist. The cave is safe. The fire is low. The world is quiet. And you are ready to dream.
The sensory symphony of the deep cave. We've seen the seasons shift and the winter brain begin to thaw. But before we fully leave Grog's world for the next era of historical disasters, we need to linger one last time on the sensory landscape of that cave. To truly understand why they had the best sleep, we have to move past the furs and the fire and talk about the acoustics. You see, a cave isn't just a hole in the ground, it's a natural resonance chamber. If you've ever been in a truly deep cavern, you know that the silence isn't actually silent. It has a weight. It has a texture. For our Paleolithic family, the cave provided a pink noise environment that would make a modern sleep app developer weep with envy. There was the constant rhythmic drip of water from a stalactite 300 feet back in the dark, a liquid ticking clock that never sped up and never slowed down. There was the way the wind, when it did manage to whistle past the entrance, was filtered into a low, bass-heavy hum by the limestone walls.
This was the original white noise machine. It masked the sudden snaps of breaking twigs outside or the distant scuffles of nocturnal animals. It created a consistent auditory safety blanket that allowed the human brain to disengage its threat detection software and fully commit to the REM cycle. And then there was the smell. Now I know what you're thinking. Surely a cave filled with unwashed humans and animal hides smelled like a locker room that's been left in the sun. But here's where Grog's dry humor, if he could speak to us, would come in. He'd probably point out that our modern world smells like exhaust fumes, bleached chemicals, and synthetic fragrances that give him a headache. In the cave, the scent profile was deeply earthy. It was the smell of damp stone, which has a mineral sweetness to it. It was the scent of wood smoke, which we are evolutionarily hardwired to find comforting because smoke meant warmth and no predators. And most importantly, it was the smell of the earth itself. Scientists have discovered that soil contains a bacteria called Mycobacterium vaccae, which, when inhaled, actually mirrors the effect of antidepressant drugs. It triggers the release of serotonin in the brain. So by sleeping on a floor lined with earth and organic matter, Grog wasn't just being dirty, he was literally huffing nature's Prozac. No wonder they could sleep for 12 hours straight without a care in the world. But let's look at the ironic contrasts of their bedtime routine. We think we're so advanced with our smart pillows and our temperature-controlled mattresses, yet we suffer from social jet lag and chronic insomnia. Grog, meanwhile, was living in a literal rock, but his circadian rhythm was as precise as an atomic clock. He knew exactly when the atmospheric pressure changed. He knew when a storm was coming 2 days before it hit, because his joints and his ears were tuned to the cave's internal barometric pressure. This meant there were no surprises. If a blizzard was coming, the tribe knew. They'd just pull the front door, usually a heavy hide or a wall of brush, a little tighter and settle in. There's a certain snarky satisfaction in realizing that the poverty of the Stone Age was actually a wealth of peace. They didn't have revenge bedtime procrastination because they didn't feel like they were losing their lives to a corporate machine. Their day was their own. If they wanted to spend 4 hours staring at a crack in the ceiling that looked vaguely like a bison, they did. And that mental stillness paved a way for a sleep so deep it probably felt like a temporary departure from the physical world. Let's talk about the midnight philosophers one more time. In the deep winter, when food was scarce and the fire was the only thing standing between the tribe and the void, a strange kind of egalitarianism took over. In the dark, everyone is the same height. The tribal leader, the best hunter, the grandmother, and the youngest child all were reduced to the same basic human needs: warmth, breath, and companionship. This lack of status anxiety is a huge factor in sleep quality. Grog didn't lie awake wondering if the chief thought his flint napping was subpar. He didn't worry if his cave wall art was getting enough likes from the neighboring tribe. His value was intrinsic. He was there. He was part of the pile. He contributed his body heat, and that was enough. As we move toward the final embers of this story, imagine the cave at its most peaceful point. It's that hour before dawn, the blue hour. Outside, the world is a monochromatic landscape of frost and shadow. But inside, the air is thick with the collective warmth of 20 humans. The fire is just a bed of glowing jewels, casting a faint crimson light on the underside of the firs. If you were to stand in the center of that cave, you wouldn't hear individual breaths. You'd hear a single, unified pulse. The tribe had become a single organism, hibernating in the heart of the mountain. It's the ultimate expression of human belonging. Grog shifts. He feels the weight of a child's arm across his chest. He smells the faint scent of dried mint from the bedding. He hears the rhythmic plip, plip of the water in the back of the cave. He isn't thinking about the brutality of nature. He isn't thinking about the struggle for survival. He's thinking about how good it feels to be exactly where he is. And as the first, weakest light of a late winter sun begins to hit the very edge of the cave entrance, Grog doesn't jump up to start his day. He just pulls the mammoth hide a little higher, tucks his chin into the fur, and decides that the world can wait another hour. Because in the Paleolithic, the world always waited. So, as you drift off tonight, try to find your inner cave. Ignore the hum of the refrigerator. Ignore the glow of the street lamp through the curtains. Imagine the weight of the mountain above you. Imagine the bug-repellent ash beneath you. Imagine the smell of wood smoke and old stone. You are safe. You are warm. You are part of a lineage of sleepers that stretches back to the beginning of time. The winter is outside, but you are inside, and inside is all that matters. The story of the cave is over for now, but the sleep is just beginning.
The legacy of the Stone Age snooze. So, we've spent the night in Grog's cave, navigating the furs, the communal piles, and the midnight snacks of marrow and berries. But as we reach the final stretch of this prehistoric lullaby, we have to ask ourselves, what happened to that perfect, heavy sleep? Why did we trade the rhythmic drip of a limestone cavern for the buzzing of a smartphone and the persistent hum of an air conditioner? As the sun finally begins to climb over the ridge of our Paleolithic valley, the cave inhabitants don't wake up with a jolt. There's no shot of espresso, no frantic checking of the news. Instead, there's the slow awakening. This was a period of perhaps an hour where the tribe just existed in a state of semi-consciousness. They would watch the dust motes dancing in the first shafts of light. They would stretch slowly, feeling the stiffness of the cold air outside their blankets. This gradual transition is something modern science calls sleep inertia, and we usually fight it with everything we've got. But for Grog, it was a feature, not a bug. It was the time for the brain to integrate the dreams of the night into the reality of the day. It was a gentle bridge between the spirit world and the physical world. But let's get a little snarky about the progress that followed. Eventually, humans decided that caves were a bit too permanent. We wanted to wander. We built huts of bone and skin, and later houses of wood and stone. And with every step away from the cave, we lost a little bit of that environmental insulation. We started having to worry about property. We started worrying about who owned which patch of dirt. And nothing ruins a good night's sleep like the creeping anxiety of land management. By the time we reached the agricultural revolution, the best sleep was already in decline. Instead of sleeping when the body said sleep, we started sleeping when the crops allowed it. We became slaves to the season in a way Grog never was. If the harvest was coming, you didn't get to hibernate. You worked until your bones ached, and your sleep became a desperate, heavy thing born of exhaustion rather than the natural, rhythmic peace of the cave. We traded the communal pile for privacy, which sounds great until you realize that privacy often just means being alone with your own worries. Let's float back to the sensory experience of the cave one last time to compare it to our modern sleep hygiene. Today, we buy blackout curtains to mimic the darkness of the deep cave. We buy sound machines to mimic the wind and the dripping water. We buy weighted blankets to mimic the heavy mammoth hides. We are essentially spending a fortune trying to recreate a Paleolithic environment that Grog got for free just by being born. There's a profound irony in the fact that the primitive life was in many ways the peak of human neurological comfort. Grog's winter brain wasn't cluttered with a million abstract concepts. He didn't know what a career was. He didn't have a personal brand. He was just a human animal, and his brain was tuned to the frequencies of the earth. When he looked at the fire, he didn't see a utility bill. He saw a friend.
When he looked at his family, he didn't see obligations. He saw the heat that would keep him alive through the night. As the sleepless historian, I find a quiet, dry humor in our obsession with optimizing our lives. We take supplements, we track our sleep cycles on our watches, and we read books about how to be more productive. Meanwhile, 30,000 years ago, a guy with a slightly crooked nose and a very warm reindeer pelt was getting better rest than 99% of the modern population simply because he knew how to be still. He knew that during the brutal winter, doing nothing was the most productive thing a human could do. It was the ultimate act of defiance against a harsh environment. To sleep while the world freezes is the flex of the highest order. As we conclude this long, wandering journey through the prehistoric night, I want you to imagine the cave one last time. The fire is now just a memory of warmth in the center of the room. The tribe has finally stood up, shaking off the lethargy of the night. They move to the entrance, shielding their eyes against the brilliance of the snow. They are refreshed. Not caffeinated refreshed, but deep soul refreshed. They are ready for the walk, the hunt, or the simple act of gathering wood. They are grounded. But for us, the sun isn't up yet. We are still in the quiet hours. We can still pretend for just a little while that the walls of our room are made of solid limestone. We can imagine that the hum of the city is just the distant roar of a prehistoric river. We can pull our modern furs up to our chins and let our winter brains take over. The history of the world is a long, loud, and often very violent story. It's a story of kings and queens losing their heads, of empires rising and falling, and of people making the same genetic mistakes over and over again. But beneath all that noise, there is this older story, the story of the sleep, the story of the quiet cave. It's the story that links you directly to grog. When you close your eyes and feel that heavy, sinking sensation of drifting off, you are doing exactly what your ancestors did in the valleys of France, the mountains of the Urals, and the plains of Africa. You are participating in the oldest human tradition. So, don't worry about the brutal winter of the modern world. Don't worry about the metaphors for the cold that we all carry around. Just focus on the pile. Focus on the warmth. Focus on the slow, steady rhythm of your own heart, the same heartbeat that echoed off the cave walls 30,000 years ago. The mammoths are gone, the glaciers have retreated, but the cave is still there, inside your mind, waiting for you whenever the world gets too loud. Go there now, find your spot near the embers, adjust your furs, and just let go. The history can wait till tomorrow. Tonight, we just sleep. Good night, guys. I hope this was boring enough to help you drift off. And remember, if you wake up in the middle of the night, don't check your phone. Just imagine you're checking the fire. Toss a mental branch on the coals, listen to the imaginary drip of the cave water, and sink back into the deep, dark velvet of the prehistoric night. I'll see you in the next disaster. But for now, just rest.
The genetics of the great huddle. As the pale light of morning begins to brush against the entrance of our prehistoric sanctuary, we have to touch upon one final, slightly awkward but undeniably cozy aspect of our ancestors' winter survival, the genetics of the huddle. Now, in the modern era, we are very concerned with things like personal boundaries and individual identity. But if you were to tell Grog that one day humans would sleep in separate rooms, behind locked doors, he would probably look at you with the same confusion he'd have for a smartphone. To him, the social unit wasn't just a concept, it was a literal heat source. Let's look at this with a bit of that dry, sleepless historian irony. We often talk about royal inbreeding in later centuries, the Habsburgs and their famous chins, or the Ptolemies who took keeping it in the family a bit too literally. But 30,000 years ago, the genetic pool was more like a genetic puddle.
When the winter hit and the world shrank to the size of a single cave, your dating options were, let's just say, limited. But here's the thing. While the royals of the 17th century did it for power and purity, Grog's people did it for the most basic reason of all, survival and warmth. In a small tribe of 30 people, everyone was your cousin. And when the temperature dropped to 40 below, you weren't looking for a genetically diverse match. You were looking for the person with the thickest fur cloak and the most consistent body heat. There's a strange, sleepy comfort in that total lack of choice. There's no dating app fatigue when the only people you see for 4 months are the ones you grew up with. It removes a layer of social anxiety that we modern humans carry like a heavy backpack. In the cave, you didn't have to perform. You didn't have to be interesting. You just had to be warm. This communal living created a specific type of psychological peace. Scientists have noted that humans are one of the few species that evolved for cooperative breeding and communal defense. Our brains are literally hardwired to feel safest when we are surrounded by the smells and sounds of our kin. When Grog fell asleep, his subconscious wasn't scanning for danger. It was being reassured by the collective snoring of his entire support system. It was the ultimate weighted blanket made of human connection. And let's be a bit snarky about the royal comparison. Later in history, kings would sleep in massive, drafty stone castles surrounded by gold and silk, yet they were often miserable. They had guards at the door because they were terrified of being stabbed in their sleep. They had tasters for their food because they were worried about poison. They were the most powerful people on earth, and yet they probably had the worst sleep quality in human history. Grog, on the other hand, had nothing. He owned a sharp stick and a very nice rock, but he slept with the total, unshakable confidence of a man who knew that if a wolf showed up, 20 of his closest relatives would be awake and swinging clubs before he even opened his eyes. That is a level of security that a Swiss bank account just can't provide. As we drift further into the morning light, let's consider the caveman aesthetic. We think of them as dirty, but they were actually quite meticulous about their sleep spaces. They would use fire to heat-treat the stone floors before laying down the bedding, which not only dried out any dampness, but also killed off bacteria. They were practicing hot stone therapy tens of thousands of years before it cost $200 at a resort in Sedona. The ironic contrast here is that Grog was living a life of forced minimalism that we now try to achieve through expensive decluttering seminars. He didn't have stuff to worry about. His winter wardrobe was the same one he'd had for 3 years, and it worked perfectly. His kitchen gadgets were a flat stone and a heavy bone. This lack of material clutter meant there was nothing for his mind to latch onto when he was trying to drift off. No, did I leave the oven on? No, did I remember to lock the car? Just the steady, rhythmic dripping of the cave and the low, comforting hum of the tribe. As the sun rises higher, we see the transition from the night mode to the day mode. In the cave, this was done with a remarkable lack of urgency. There was no morning rush. One person might wake up, stretch, and spend 30 minutes just staring at the fire. Then another would join them. They'd share a handful of pine nuts or a bit of dried meat from the winter stores. They were masters of the soft start. This is something we've completely lost. We jerk ourselves awake with buzzing alarms and immediate hits of dopamine from our screens. We force our brains from 0 to 60 in a matter of seconds. But Grog's brain was allowed to spool up like an old engine. By the time he actually stepped out of the cave and into the blinding white of the snowy valley, he was fully present. He was mindful before it was a buzzword. He would stand there, the cold air hitting his face, that sharp, bracing, prehistoric oxygen that hasn't been filtered through a million tailpipes. He'd take a deep breath, feel the sun on his skin, and know that he had survived another night. He had conquered the brutal winter simply by being the best at resting. As we end this chapter of our journey, think about the silence of that snowy valley. It's a silence so deep you can hear your own heartbeat. Grog turns back to the cave, where the rest of his family is still slowly untangling themselves from the furs. He smiles, not a big, dramatic smile, but a small, tired, satisfied one. The world is cold, yes. The world is dangerous, sure. But the cave is warm, and the sleep was good. And really, at the end of the day, or the beginning of it, isn't that all any of us are looking for? A place where the wind can't find us, where the fire stays lit, and where we are surrounded by people who will help us carry the weight of the dark. So, go ahead and settle into your own modern-day cave. Let your winter brain take over. Forget the frantic energy of the sun and embrace the slow, heavy velvet of the shadows. You have a long history of sleepers behind you, cheering you on with their quiet, rhythmic breaths. You're doing great. You're doing exactly what you were evolved to do. Just sink in. The limestone is cool, the furs are warm, and the dream world is waiting. Good night, Grog. Good night, everyone.
The dream walkers and the cave walls. As the morning light begins to dominate the entrance of our Paleolithic suite, we find ourselves lingering in that strange, hazy borderland between waking and sleeping. This is the realm of the dream walkers. For Grog and his family, dreams weren't just random neurological firings or a side effect of eating too much fermented reindeer lichen. They were a second life, a nocturnal reality that was just as valid as the one involving flint tools and frozen rivers. Think about the irony of our modern approach to dreams. We categorize them as just a dream. We wake up, shake them off, and rush to a meeting. But in the deep, slow hours of a prehistoric winter, a dream was a dispatch from the spirit world. If Grog dreamt of a great bison with golden fur, he didn't wake up and check a dream dictionary app. He woke up and realized he had been visited by the essence of the hunt. This made the bedtime experience incredibly profound. You weren't just going to sleep, you were going on a journey. And because the cave was a sensory deprivation chamber, dark, quiet, and isolated, these dreams were likely more vivid, more cinematic, and more cohesive than the fragmented stress dreams we have today about forgetting our passwords or showing up to work without trousers. Imagine the theater of the mind in a world with zero light pollution. When Grog closed his eyes, his brain had a completely blank canvas to work with. The images he conjured were bright, sharp, and laden with meaning. This is where the snarky side of history meets the deeply mystical. We look at cave paintings and think, oh, how primitive, they liked drawing cows. But many archaeologists now believe these paintings were actually stills from their dreams. The back of the cave, the deepest, darkest, most oxygen-deprived parts, were where they went to record these visions. When Grog crawled into a narrow limestone crevice with a small stone lamp filled with animal fat, he was essentially uploading his dreams to the hard drive of the mountain. He'd paint an animal not as it looked in the field, but as it looked in his mind, flickering, powerful, and slightly supernatural. And why not? If you've been trapped in a cave for 3 weeks because of a blizzard, your imagination is going to start doing some heavy lifting. You're going to start seeing things in the shadows. You're going to start hearing voices in the wind. To Grog, this wasn't a breakdown, it was an opening. He was the original sleepless historian, recording the history of his soul on a wall of rock. Let's float over to the dry humor of these painting sessions. Can you imagine the prehistoric art critics? Grog's uncle leaning against a stalagmite, grunting about how the mammoth's legs are a bit too short, or how the ochre is the wrong shade of red. There's a timelessness to human pettiness, even in the depths of a sacred cave. It's a bit derivative, Grog. We did horses last winter. Give us something fresh. But even with the critics, the act of painting was part of the sleep cycle. It was the debrief. You dream, you wake, you eat, you paint. It was a closed loop of human experience. Contrast this with our modern bedroom aesthetic.
We have white walls, maybe a generic print of a sunset, and a pile of laundry in the corner. Grog had a gallery of his ancestors' greatest hits. He slept beneath a ceiling covered with the stories of his people. He was literally surrounded by his history. This sense of place is something we lack. We move from apartment to apartment, house to house. But for Grog, that cave might have been used by his family for 500 years. The very air he breathed was filtered through the history of his lineage. When he touched the wall, he might be putting his hand over a handprint made by his great-great-grandfather. That's a level of grounding that makes insomnia almost impossible. How can you be anxious when you are physically part of a 5-century-long story? As we reach the final, most tranquil part of our journey, let's consider the caveman's lullaby. It wasn't a song, necessarily. It was the sound of the earth. In the winter, the earth is quiet, but it's not dead. There's the low-frequency vibration of the wind over the ridges. There's the shifting of the tectonic plates, a sound so deep it's felt rather than heard. This is the mother thrum. It's the sound of the womb. And for Grog, tucked in his little limestone pocket, wrapped in the warmth of his tribe and the scent of the fire, it was the ultimate signal that all was well. The brutal winter wasn't an enemy, it was a protective barrier. It kept the predators away. It kept the rival tribes in their own caves. It forced a period of rest and reflection that we, in our infinite wisdom, have decided is unproductive. But as the sleepless historian, I think Grog had the right idea. In the modern world, we pride ourselves on hustle. We celebrate the grind. We drink energy drinks to fight off the very thing our bodies are begging for. We look at Grog and see a savage who struggled to survive. But Grog looks at us through the long lens of time and sees a people who have forgotten to breathe. He sees a people who are terrified of the dark, who have lost their pile, and who have forgotten that the best things in life happen when you're doing absolutely nothing. So, as the sun finally clears the horizon in our Paleolithic valley and the tribe begins to stir for real, let's take one last look at Grog. He's standing at the cave entrance, scratching his beard, watching a hawk circle in the crisp blue sky. He's well rested, he's calm, he's ready. He survived the winter not by fighting it, but by embracing the snooze. And as we fade out of his world and back into ours, try to take a bit of that limestone peace with you. The world is still cold, and the winters of our modern lives are still brutal in their own way. But you have a cave, you have a fire, and you have the ability to simply stop. The dreams are waiting, the ochre is ready, the reindeer furs are piled high. It's time to close the gallery for the night. The museum is shutting down. The history is written. Good night, Grog. Good night, explorers. Sleep as if you have nowhere to be and nothing to prove. Because for the next 8 hours, you don't. Sweet dreams of mammoths and golden bisons.
The prehistoric midnight pantry. As the morning sun continues its slow, golden crawl across the uneven floor of our cave, we find ourselves retreating once more into the shadows for a moment. We need to talk about the Paleolithic midnight snack. Because, let's be honest, no matter how deep the sleep or how thick the reindeer fur, the human body is a furnace. And in the dead of a 30,000-year-old winter, that furnace needs fuel at the most inconvenient hours. In our modern, high-stress world, we have fridge guilt. We tiptoe into the kitchen at 2 a.m., illuminated by the cold, judgmental blue light of the refrigerator, looking for a slice of processed turkey or a spoonful of peanut butter. But for Grog, the midnight snack was a matter of biological necessity, and surprisingly, a very sophisticated bit of early science. You see, Grog didn't have sugar. He didn't have empty carbs. When he woke up in the middle of a freezing night, his body wasn't craving a snack, it was craving thermogenesis. He needed something that would burn slow and hot to keep his internal temperature stable until the sun came up. And for that, he turned to the greatest superfood of the Stone Age, bone marrow. Imagine Grog sitting up quietly in the dim glow of the embers. He reaches into a stone cache near his sleeping mat and pulls out a split femur of a wild horse or a reindeer. Inside that bone is a dense, fatty, nutrient-rich treasure. Marrow is almost pure fat, and fat is the ultimate slow-burn fuel. It's the prehistoric equivalent of a high-end, time-release energy bar. There's something incredibly rhythmic and soothing about the sound of someone scraping a bone in a quiet cave. Scrape, crunch, swallow. It's a sound that hasn't changed in a million years. And as Grog eats that rich, buttery marrow, his body begins to produce heat. It's a gentle, internal glow that spreads from his stomach to his fingertips. It's the original comfort food. But the dry humor of the situation lies in the gourmet nature of it all. We think of cavemen as eating raw, bloody chunks of meat, but Grog was a bit more refined. He might have had a small pouch of dried fruit leather, mashed crowberries or wild currants that had been dried in the sun months ago. A little bit of tartness to cut through the heavy fat of the marrow. It was a balanced palate, even if the plate was just a flat piece of slate. Because why not double down on the culinary experience when you have nothing but time? Let's float over to the beverages of the night. Grog didn't have chamomile tea, but he did have access to various herbal infusions. Archaeologists have found evidence of birch polypore mushrooms and various barks being kept in cave dwellings. When steeped in water heated by a hot stone dropped into a leather pouch, these created bitter, earthy teas that acted as mild sedatives or anti-inflammatories. He was essentially drinking a sleepy time tea that actually worked, rather than one that just has a cute bear on the box. The social aspect of this midnight pantry was also quite fascinating. In a communal pile, you can't exactly eat a snack in secret. If Grog starts gnawing on a bone, his brother or his cousin is going to wake up. And instead of a shh, go back to sleep, it turns into a low-stakes, hushed conversation. This was the time for the small talk of the Stone Age. Did you see the way the ice is forming on the creek? The fire smells a bit like damp oak tonight, don't you think? I think I'm going to make a new scraper tomorrow, or maybe the day after. There is a profound lack of urgency in these conversations. In the modern world, if we're awake at 3 a.m., we're usually worrying about the big things: death, taxes, the climate, that weird thing we said to a coworker in 2014. But Grog's worries were immediate and physical. Is the fire alive? Is the baby warm? Is there marrow left? Once those questions were answered with a yes, the anxiety disappeared. The simplicity of his needs made the return to sleep almost instantaneous. And then there's the aromatic side of the snack. We've mentioned the medicinal plants in the bedding, but the smells of the winter pantry were just as important. The scent of dried meat, the resinous tang of stored pine nuts, the faint sweetness of dried berries, these were the safe smells. To a hunter-gatherer, the smell of food storage is the smell of a future. It's the olfactory proof that you're not going to starve before spring. That realization is the ultimate sedative. It's the all-clear signal for the nervous system. As Grog finishes his marrow and wipes his hands on a piece of soft moss, he feels that heavy, warm lethargy creeping back into his limbs. The fat is doing its work. His metabolism is humming along at a steady, efficient pace. He doesn't need to count sheep. He just needs to listen to the cave. He lies back down, shifting his weight until he fits perfectly into the groove he's worn into the bedding over the last few months. He feels the collective warmth of the tribe, a living, breathing radiator, and he drifts. The irony, of course, is that we now spend billions of dollars on biohacking our diets for better sleep. We talk about keto adaptation and intermittent fasting and optimal macronutrients. Grog was doing all of it by accident. He was the ultimate optimized human, not because he was trying to be, but because he had no other choice. He was perfectly in sync with his biology because there was nothing to pull him out of it. No artificial light to trick his brain into thinking it was noon, no caffeine to spike his cortisol, just the fire, the marrow, and the mountain. As we reach the end of this part of our monologue, think about that feeling of a full belly sleep, not the bloated, uncomfortable feeling of a late-night pizza, but the dense, grounded satisfaction of real ancestral fuel. It's a feeling that makes the bed feel softer and the blankets feel heavier. The cave is silent again. The midnight snackers have retreated into their dreams. The only thing left is the slow, red pulse of the coals and the smell of ancient dust and cold stone. Grog is gone now, lost to the thousands of years that separate us. But that feeling of being tucked away, fed and safe, that's still yours. You can claim it whenever you want. You have to let the modern world fade away. You have to imagine the stone walls rising up around you. You have to listen for the drip of the water in the dark. The brutal winter is just a story we tell ourselves. Inside the cave, it's always the same. It's always warm, it's always quiet, and the marrow is always plenty. So, take a deep, slow breath. Feel the warmth in your own internal furnace. Let your thoughts become as slow and heavy as a mammoth's footfall in the deep snow. You've done enough today. You've gathered your wood, you've tended your fire. Now, it's time to just be. Good night, Grog. Good night, fellow travelers. I'll be here when you wake, but for now, the cave is yours.